The sun was barely up, but the streets of Geneva were already buzzing with an unusual energy. It was Easter Sunday, a day of celebration for many, but for the people of Geneva, it was a day of tension. The churches were packed to the brim, and the air was thick with anticipation. A rowdy crowd poured up the street to Saint Pierre, eager to see what would happen. Across the river, at Saint-Gervais, the church was equally crowded. The city was on edge, and everyone wondered, would the preachers preach? After a sleepless night, the preachers made their way to the churches. John Calvin, with his bony fingers gripping the pulpit rail, stood before a congregation of several thousand people. His piercing eyes scanned the angry, buzzing crowd. The atmosphere was electric, and the tension was palpable. Calvin began his sermon, his voice clear and firm. How can we reach forth our hands to receive the bread and wine of the Holy Communion when we have sinned so stubbornly against the crucified Christ? He asked. Can the Holy Supper be celebrated in the midst of fighting and rioting? God forbid. The congregation was stunned. No one had expected such a strong message. The mood shifted from anticipation to anger. Across the river, at Saint-Gervais, the preacher William Farel faced a similar reaction. The Holy Communion was not celebrated that Easter Sunday morning in either church. As the preachers moved through the muttering crowds to their homes, the tension only grew. Later that afternoon, Calvin took the pulpit at the Church of the Rive. Down by the shore of the lake, the crowd waited in ominous silence. Calvin spoke about the troubles in Geneva, and as he did, men leaped up with swords flashing. Shouting and fighting, they pushed toward the pulpit. Friends of Calvin rushed to his side, forming a human shield around him. By a miracle, a witness later reported, no blood was shed. The human shield escorted Calvin up the streets to his door, but the trouble was far from over. Late on Sunday night, the syndics met in a special session. The next day, the Council of 200 gathered to make a decision. The verdict was swift and harsh. Calvin, Corot, and Farel were given 3 days to lead the city. The herald with his silver-topped stick announced the sentence. Calvin, with a calm and steady voice, replied, "Well and good. If we had served men, we would have been ill requited, but we serve a good master who will reward us." 3 French pastors, Calvin, the old blind man Corot, and the red-bearded Farel, mounted their rented horses and rode over the drawbridge, past the armored sentry, and out of the city gate. They were leaving Geneva, the city where they had hoped to bring reform and order. It was April 25, 1538. The journey to Basel was long and difficult. Calvin and Farel were soaked by the rain and completely worn out. Calvin wrote to his friend Viritin Lausanne, "We have at length reached Basel, but well soaked with the rain and completely spent and worn out. Nor was our journey free from perils, for in truth, one of us was almost carried away by the swollen currents. But we have experienced more tender treatment from the impetuous river than from our fellow men." Despite the challenges, Calvin and Farel were determined to defend themselves before the city council in Bern and at a synod of Swiss churches in Zurich. They hoped to explain their actions and perhaps be reinstated. But the councils of Geneva had not changed their minds. A herald met them on their way back to Geneva, carrying a letter that commanded them not to re-enter the city. With no other options, Calvin and Farel set out for Basel, the city where Calvin had once found a quiet retreat, but their plans were soon disrupted. Farel was called to Neuchâtel, and Calvin received an invitation to Strasbourg. In July, he visited the Strasbourg pastors, who begged him to become the pastor of the French refugees who were fleeing persecution in France. Calvin was torn. He wrote to Duthier, "I shall retire to Basel, waiting to understand what the Lord would have me do." But the hand of God seemed to guide him. In early September, less than 5 months after leaving Geneva, Calvin arrived in Strasbourg. The city was a stark contrast to the chaos of Geneva. Strasbourg was peaceful, with a mayor who supported the Reformation and a well-organized system of schools and churches. Calvin found a new home in the little church of Saint Nicolas, where he preached to the French refugees. The people listened eagerly, and for the first time in months, Calvin felt a sense of peace. But the journey to Strasbourg was not without its challenges. Calvin wrote to Farel, "Last Sabbath day your nephew was seized with the plague. I visited him as soon as my health allowed it. When signs of certain death appeared, I strove to give him medicine for the soul rather than for the body. He departed to the Lord this morning at about 5 o'clock." Despite the difficulties, Calvin found a new purpose in Strasbourg. He became a busy pastor, teacher, and writer. He published a new edition of his Institutes, gave public lectures on the Bible, and wrote commentaries and treatises. He even joined a guild of tailors to become a citizen of the city. In Strasbourg, Calvin found a new beginning, but the lessons of Geneva stayed with him. He was more willing to listen and learn, and he approached his work with a sense of humility and patience. The city of Strasbourg, with its peaceful streets and vibrant community, became a haven for the young pastor who had once faced the fury of a city. Calvin and Farel had a bit of a financial dilemma. They owed money to the man they had been staying with in Basel. The landlord sent a bill, which included the cost of wine. Calvin wasn't sure if the wine had been a gift from a friend, but the landlord had charged for it anyway. Calvin wrote to Farel, figuring out how to split the bill. He calculated that Farel had stayed for 7 weeks and 2 days, while Calvin had stayed for 2 months and 12 days. So Calvin decided to pay 5 gold crowns, and Farel should pay 4. Calvin still owed Farel a crown and a half, which he promised to pay as soon as possible. Calvin had only about 20 shillings of Basel money left, and he had no extra coins to spare. Around this time, a friend named Duthier wrote to Calvin from France. Duthier offered to help Calvin with money, saying that Calvin might be short on cash. He even suggested that Calvin return to France, hinting that Calvin might consider rejoining the Church of Rome. But Calvin was firm in his beliefs. He thanked Duthier for the offer but politely declined, saying he didn't want to be a burden and that he was sure God had led him to his work in Strasbourg and the Protestant churches. Not long after, a man who seemed very pious and sincere came to see Calvin. The man was so convincing that Calvin lent him 20 batzen, which was about 18 gold francs. The man left a small basket of his belongings as a pledge that he would return to pay back the loan. A few months later, the man came back and asked Calvin if he could lend him more money. Calvin, who was already in need of the money he had lent, refused. The man never returned to repay the debt. A year and a half later, Calvin decided to open the basket. He called over his friend Sturm and a few others. They opened the basket and found some rotten prunes, tattered clothes, frayed books, and stolen letters. Calvin and his friends couldn't help but laugh at the swindler's trick, even though Calvin had been fooled. Calvin eventually rented a house where he took in some students as boarders. Things weren't always peaceful. Sometimes the students didn't pay their rent, and the housekeeper had a sharp tongue that often caused trouble. Calvin himself, dealing with frequent headaches and stomach aches, sometimes lost his temper. One day, Calvin's old acquaintance Caroline, who had previously accused Calvin and Farel of not believing in the Trinity, showed up again. Caroline claimed to have converted back to Protestantism and came to Switzerland. Calvin and Farel decided to forgive the past and welcome Caroline back. But Caroline quickly started, causing trouble again, trying to make the other ministers suspicious of Calvin. The ministers and Caroline drew up some statements of doctrine and sent them to Calvin late at night for his signature. Calvin was torn. If he signed, he would be compromising his beliefs. If he refused, Caroline would accuse him of being a troublemaker. Calvin became very upset and lost his temper at a meeting with the ministers. He vowed never to sign the statements and left the room. Later, Bucer calmed him down and brought him back to the meeting. Calvin went home that night feeling very guilty and sad, weeping over his loss of control. More sadness came to Strasbourg. Calvin's friend Corot, who had been a blind companion, died. There were rumors that Corot had been poisoned. Calvin was deeply grieved and wrote to Farel expressing his overwhelming sorrow. He couldn't sleep or focus on his work, and the thought of Corot's death kept him up at night. Around the same time, Calvin's cousin, Olivetan, who had been a key figure in introducing Calvin to the Reformation, also died. Calvin was heartbroken. Despite the losses, Calvin had a supportive community in Strasbourg. He had his stepsister Marie and his brother Antoine living with him. They had left their hometown of Noyon to be with their famous brother. Calvin was grateful for their presence. Bucer, a friend and mentor, kept suggesting that Calvin should get married. In February 1539, Calvin wrote to Farel about a potential bride who was expected to arrive after Easter. He asked Farel to come and bless the marriage, but the wedding never happened. A few months later, Calvin was still thinking about marriage. He described to Farel the kind of woman he was looking for: chaste, not too fussy, economical, patient, and interested in his health. In February 1540, Calvin was still unmarried but hopeful. A noblewoman with a good fortune was proposed to him, but he was deterred because she didn't speak their language and might be too mindful of her family. Calvin's brother Antoine helped arrange another potential match, but Calvin had reservations. He didn't want to marry someone he wasn't sure about. By March, Calvin was still in a state of uncertainty and felt annoyed by the situation. Finally, in August 1540, Calvin got married. Farel came from Neuchâtel to perform the ceremony. Calvin's bride, Idelette de Bure, was a widow with 2 children. She was a member of Calvin's congregation of refugees in Strasbourg. Idelette was everything Calvin had hoped for in a wife: chaste, not fussy, economical, patient, and interested in his health. She was also very beautiful. The marriage wasn't without its challenges. Calvin and Idelette both suffered from frequent illnesses. Less than a month after the wedding, Calvin fell ill. And soon after, Idelette also became sick. Despite their health issues, they supported each other and remained content with their life together. Calvin's work for the Lord couldn't wait for good health. Even while sick, he continued to deliberate with his friends, Capito and Bucer. The Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Charles V, was trying to unite the Protestant and Catholic churches to fight against the Turks. Calvin was asked to represent Strasbourg at the imperial diets, where the German states and free cities discussed this union. Calvin didn't expect much from these meetings, but he observed and analyzed everything carefully, writing detailed letters to Farel about the events. At the diets, Calvin met important figures like Philip Melanchthon, a key figure in the Reformation and a close friend of Martin Luther. Melanchthon and Calvin formed a strong friendship that lasted until Melanchthon's death. Melanchthon was a gentle and peace-loving man, which was a stark contrast to Luther's more confrontational style. Calvin and Melanchthon discussed many important issues, and their friendship was a significant part of Calvin's life in Strasbourg. John Calvin sat in a room in Worms, Germany, his face buried in his hands. He had just received a letter from Geneva, a city he had once led but had been forced to leave. The letter was an urgent plea for him to return. Calvin was torn. He had found a peaceful life in Strasbourg, where he was respected and loved. But the call from Geneva was strong, and he couldn't ignore it. The letter from Geneva was formal but heartfelt. It was signed by the city's leaders, and it spoke of the people's desire for Calvin to come back. The city was in turmoil, and they believed only Calvin could bring order and stability. The letter ended with the city's motto, Post tenebris, spero lucem. After darkness, I hope for light. Calvin's friends in Strasbourg were with him, trying to help him make a decision. They knew how much he had struggled with this. Calvin was a man of deep faith, and he believed that his actions should always be guided by what would best serve God and the spread of the gospel. "Help me, my friends," Calvin said, his voice breaking. "Tell me what I must do. Think only of what is best for the glory of God, not for me." His friends were torn. They wanted Calvin to stay in Strasbourg, where he was safe and respected. But they also knew that if God was calling him to Geneva, they couldn't stand in his way. They advised him to wait until the imperial diet in Worms was over before making a final decision. While waiting, Calvin spent time with Philip Melanchthon, a close friend and fellow reformer. They debated and discussed the issues facing the Protestant churches. Melanchthon had given Calvin the nickname the Theologian. After Calvin won a debate against a Roman Catholic theologian, the nickname was a sign of deep respect. Calvin's mind was never far from Geneva. Even before the letter, he had been writing to the city, trying to guide them from a distance. He had written a long letter to Cardinal Jacopo Sadoleto, who had tried to persuade Geneva to return to the Catholic Church. Calvin's response was so powerful that Sadoleto never replied. In Strasbourg, Calvin had heard about the chaos in Geneva. The city's new ministers were weak, and the people were living wildly. The situation was getting worse, and the city's leaders were desperate for Calvin's return. The news from Geneva kept coming. The city's councils passed harsh laws, but they weren't enforced. Two of the city's leaders who had opposed Calvin were executed for treason. The remaining leaders who had opposed him fled. The people of Geneva began to realize that they needed Calvin's strong leadership. In the autumn of 1540, the city's councils officially decided to ask Calvin to return. They wrote letters and sent messengers to Strasbourg. They even asked other Protestant cities to help persuade Strasbourg to let Calvin go. Calvin received many private letters from friends in Geneva, urging him to return. One wrote, "Triumph, come quickly, brother. Come, come, that we may rejoice in God our Redeemer." Another reminded him of the important work waiting for him in France and said, "The Genevan church is important. No mortal man is able to direct it with such force, so wisely and so ably as you." Even Peter Viret, a pastor in Lausanne, wrote to Calvin, encouraging him to return. Viret had agreed to go to Geneva for 6 months to help, but he knew that only Calvin could truly bring the city back to order. Calvin was in a daily agony, torn between his love for Strasbourg and his duty to Geneva. He knew that returning to Geneva would be a cross he would have to bear, but he also knew that it might be God's will. As he waited for the imperial diet to end, he prayed for guidance, hoping that the Lord would show him the right path. The city of Geneva was abuzz with excitement as the herald on horseback approached the old Cornavin gate. The man in the black cloak riding beside him was none other than John Calvin the preacher, who had been driven out 3 years ago but was now returning to the city he had once called home. The sentry at the gate, recognizing Calvin, felt a mix of curiosity and anticipation. The whole city was waiting for this moment. Calvin stepped into the council chamber, where 25 councilmen were gathered. They looked at him with a mix of relief and respect. He was older, more dignified, and more famous than when they had last seen him. The councilmen had gifts ready for him: a new black velvet robe trimmed with fur, a house on Cannon Street, and a new pulpit in St. Pierre Cathedral. They were determined to keep Calvin in Geneva, and the clerk recorded their decision. Resolved to keep Calvin here always. Calvin didn't ask to come back. He had been sent by a higher calling, and he was ready to do whatever it took to serve his master. But the memories of the city's past turmoil made him hesitate. He wrote to Farel, "As you wished, I am settled here. May the Lord overrule it for good." Wasting no time, Calvin proposed plans for the city. He knew that a church couldn't hold together without a solid government, one that followed the Word of God. He gently but firmly addressed the council, suggesting changes that would bring order to the chaotic city. He focused on the big issues, overlooking the small irritations, and he forgave the past. Despite his health issues, he was determined to make a difference. A few days after his return, the great Clement's bell of St. Pierre rang out, calling the people to a special service. The councilmen, dressed in the city's black and gray colors, attended. Calvin stood in the new pulpit and spoke about the world's troubles. The Turks were invading Hungary, the plague was spreading in Germany, and persecution was rampant in France. He called for humility and prayer, asking the Lord to protect Geneva. On the first Sunday, the people expected Calvin to speak about his exile and return, but he didn't. Instead, he resumed his sermons where he had left off 3 years ago, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. He was busy with many tasks, and the first month was exhausting. He wrote to a friend in Basel, "I had so much to attend to and so many annoyances that I was almost worn out. But I am consoled that we do not labor altogether in vain." Viret, a close friend, stayed in Geneva to help Calvin. Calvin told Farel, "I shall not suffer him to be dragged away from me." He also wrote to Bucer, the fatherly pastor in Strasbourg, "I shall give ground of offense to no one. If I do not meet your expectations, you have the power to admonish and chastise me." Meanwhile, Idelette settled into their new home at number 11 Cannon Street. The councils had provided some basic furniture, and Idelette made the house more comfortable with her own belongings. The house had 3 small bedrooms upstairs, a living room, study, and kitchen downstairs. The garden at the back was where she grew vegetables. Calvin's salary, 500 florins a year, along with 12 measures of corn and 2 casks of wine, was enough to support the household. However, the steady stream of visitors and messengers made it challenging to manage. Calvin's stepsister Marie and her husband Costin lived nearby, and his brother Antoine and his family often stayed at the house on Cannon Street. Calvin's home was a hub of activity, and in the midst of it all, he prepared sermons, wrote letters, and worked on his books. 2 weeks after his return, Calvin presented the ecclesiastical ordinances of the Church of Geneva to the councils. The document outlined a structured government for the church, reflecting the ideas he had developed in Strasbourg. The little council and the Council of 200 debated and made some changes, ensuring their own power was preserved. The councils then called the citizens together, and the General Council approved the ordinances on Sunday, November 20th, 1541. The ordinances covered many aspects of church life, from the roles of ministers to the discipline of church members. Calvin's vision was to create a church that was both orderly and faithful to God's Word. The city of Geneva was about to undergo a transformation, and Calvin was at the center of it all. The streets of Geneva were eerily quiet. Schools and shops were closed, and the few people who ventured out kept their distance from one another. The only sound that broke the silence was the jangling of the bells on the death wagon, which rolled through the empty streets, collecting the bodies of those who had succumbed to the plague. The hospital outside the city walls, known as the Pest House, was overflowing with the sick and dying. Calvin, the city's spiritual leader, was deeply troubled. He had offered to go to the plague hospital to comfort the sick, but the city council refused, knowing how much the church needed him. Instead, a French refugee named Peter Blanchet stepped forward. He bravely entered the hospital, tending to the sick and dying until he too fell ill and passed away. The plague was not just a local problem. It was raging in many cities. In Strasbourg, Calvin's friend Martin Bucer lost his wife Elizabeth and 4 of their 6 children. The grief was overwhelming. Back in Geneva, the plague returned in 1545, and another young minister volunteered to serve in the hospital. He too died from the disease. The people of Geneva were gripped by fear and hysteria. Some believed that a group of men and women were spreading the plague by smearing an ointment made from infected matter on door latches. Calvin himself believed this conspiracy was real. He wrote to a friend in Basel, describing the terror and the severe punishments that were being handed out to those suspected of spreading the disease. While the plague raged, Calvin's own family was not spared. In late July 1542, his wife Idelette gave birth prematurely. The baby Jacques lived for only 2 weeks before he died. Calvin was devastated. He wrote to his friend Viret, expressing his deep sorrow and his faith in God's providence. Idelette, already in poor health, struggled to recover from the loss. 2 years later, they had a daughter, but she too died. Another child was expected, but it was stillborn. Idelette's health continued to decline, and her endless coughing only made things worse. Despite her poor health, Idelette brought a sense of peace and order to their home on Cannon Street. She welcomed visitors, fed and lodged them, and maintained a warm and hospitable environment. Calvin's work was relentless. He rose at 5 in the morning and was busy until late at night. On Sundays, he preached multiple sermons at Saint-Pierre. During the week, he lectured, visited the sick and prisoners, and presided over the consistory meetings where the ministers and elders studied the scriptures. Calvin's duties were not limited to his religious responsibilities. He was also deeply involved in the city's affairs. At the request of the city council, he edited and compiled the laws of Geneva, working long hours to untangle the confusion in the law books. He performed marriages and baptisms and registered them in his neat handwriting. He also served as the city's unofficial post office, handling letters from all over Europe. The challenges did not end there. Calvin had to fight against his critics and enemies. He was attacked by those who disagreed with his doctrines, and he had to defend his beliefs with boldness and clarity. Despite his natural shyness, he pushed himself to engage in these battles, sometimes using forceful language and recommending harsh punishments. In the early years of his return to Geneva, Calvin managed to keep his anger in check. Idelette's quiet support and loving care likely played a role in this. She remained in the background, content to support her famous husband, and her presence brought a sense of calm to the bustling household. The years from 1544 to 1549 were marked by significant events and losses. In 1546, King Henry VIII of England died, leaving the throne to his young son Edward VI. The next year, King Francis I of France passed away, and his son Henry II continued the persecution of Protestants. In 1548, Queen Margaret of Navarre, a protector of many Protestants, died in Paris. The poet Clement Marot, who had translated Psalms into poetry, died in Turin in 1544. His work would become a cherished part of the Genevan Psalter. The death of Pope Paul III in 1549 was another significant event. Paul III had excommunicated King Henry VIII and approved the Order of Jesuits. His death marked the end of an era in the Catholic Church. The most sorrowful loss for the Protestant world was the death of Martin Luther in 1546. Luther, the father of the Reformation, died in Eisleben, the village where he was born. He was buried with great ceremony in the castle church of Wittenberg, where he had nailed his 95 Theses. His death left a void in the Protestant movement, and the disagreements that had begun during his lifetime intensified. Calvin, however, continued his work with unwavering dedication. He was in the middle of many battles, preaching, lecturing, and writing. He moved through each day without flinching, even as a new sorrow gnawed at his heart. Idolette's health was deteriorating, and the doctor could do little to help her. Calvin wrote to Virey, expressing his concern for his wife, who was barely able to support herself. The weakness and coughing were signs of a deeper illness, one that the doctors of that time could not treat. Despite the challenges, Calvin's resolve remained strong. He knew that the work he had begun with Luther must continue, and he was determined to carry it forward no matter the cost. The days in Geneva were filled with challenges. Idelette, Calvin's wife, was growing weaker, and soon she could no longer get out of bed. Calvin, despite his many duties, tried to find time to be with her. The city was bustling with refugees from France and Italy, all needing help with housing and work. The Libertines, a group that enjoyed a loose lifestyle, were causing trouble and trying to stir up the city against Calvin. He was busy editing his commentary on Hebrews, which he dedicated to Sigismund Augustus, the King of Poland. 3 days before Idolette's death, a group of ministers gathered in her room to pray. One of them encouraged her to have faith and patience. Even though she was very weak, Idelette spoke briefly, showing her deep faith. Calvin reassured her that he would take care of their children, the young man in Strasbourg and the girl Judith in the house on Cannon Street. Idelette whispered, "I have already committed them to the Lord." Calvin promised he would not neglect them, and she replied, "I know that you will not neglect those whom you know to be committed to the Lord." On March 29th, the day she died, Idelette listened to the words of a minister who came to comfort her. She spoke with a clear voice, saying, "O glorious resurrection, O God of Abraham and of all our fathers, in thee have the faithful trusted during so many past ages, and none of them have trusted in vain. I, too, will hope." These words were almost like a prayer. Calvin had to leave the room for a while, but when he returned, she was already declining. She asked everyone to pray for her, and Calvin spoke about Christ's love and the hope of eternal life. She heard his words and passed away peacefully, so quietly that those around her could hardly tell when she had gone. Calvin was left alone in the house on Cannon Street. He wrote to his friend Firet, Truly, mine is no ordinary grief. I have been bereaved of the best companion of my life. To Farel, he wrote, I do what I can to keep myself from being overwhelmed with grief. My friends also leave nothing undone that may bring relief to my mental suffering. May the Lord Jesus support me under this heavy affliction. Despite his grief, Calvin continued his duty. He didn't miss a sermon, a lecture, or a meeting with the councils. No one saw the pain he felt behind his calm exterior. In his study, with the door shut, he wrestled with his sorrow. But in the streets and in the pulpit, he masked his grief and carried on. Calvin's friends, like Viret, were amazed by his strength. Viret wrote, Wonderfully and incredibly have I been informed how you, with a heart so broken, have attended to all your duties even better than hitherto. Go on then as you have begun, and I pray God most earnestly that you may receive daily greater comfort and be strengthened more and more. Life in the house on Cannon Street continued. Brother Antoine and his family were often there, and so was Idalette's daughter Judith, until she married. Calvin had a hunchbacked servant named Pierre to take care of his needs. But the house felt different without Idalette's peaceful presence. Even from her bed, she had brought a sense of calm and serenity to the home. A year and a half after Idalette's death, Calvin wrote, My wife, a woman of rare qualities, died a year and a half ago, and I have now willingly chosen to lead a solitary life. Calvin was not just a fierce warrior for his faith. He was also a loyal and caring friend. He had close friends like Farel and Viret, who were with him through thick and thin. Farel, the older and more fiery of the two, and Viret, the steady and kind, were both dear to Calvin. They had a deep bond, and Calvin often wrote to them for support and to offer comfort. When Viret's first wife died, Calvin urged him to come to Geneva to rest and recover. He even helped Viret find a new wife, writing to a friend for help in finding a suitable match. Viret eventually found his own wife, and Calvin pronounced the wedding benediction. Calvin also kept in touch with Viret's family, sending greetings to his 3 young daughters. Calvin's friendship extended beyond his closest companions. He remained in touch with childhood, friends, and former classmates. One of the De Hangest boys, who grew up with Calvin in Noyon, wrote that he wanted to come to Geneva to live. François Daniel, a close friend from law school, wrote to Calvin even after 28 years. Calvin helped Daniel's son in Geneva and sent gold pieces to Daniel's daughters as a New Year's gift. The family of Guillaume Boude, a great thinker of France, also came to Geneva. John, one of Boude's sons, became a close friend of Calvin and an important member of the Geneva councils. In April 1549, 8 French gentlemen arrived in Geneva, including Theodore Beza. Beza, a brilliant scholar and former wild youth, had turned to the Protestant faith and decided to join Calvin in Geneva. Beza married a French girl in the Church of Saint Pierre, with Calvin officiating the ceremony. Beza became a key figure in Geneva, serving as a pastor, rector of the university, and Calvin's right-hand man. He later wrote a life of Calvin and collected his letters. Calvin's friends included leaders from other Protestant groups, even when they didn't always agree on doctrine. Bucer of Strasbourg, who became a professor at Cambridge, was a close friend. Heinrich Bullinger, the successor to Zwingli in Zurich, often corresponded with Calvin about church matters. Philip Melanchthon, a leading Lutheran, was also a friend despite their differences. Calvin longed for unity among the Protestant churches and often urged Melanchthon to take a firm stand on issues like the Lord's Supper. Calvin's friendship extended to the common people as well. He stood by the persecuted Christians in France, writing letters to encourage them in their faith. The refugees who came to Geneva found a friend in Calvin. He helped them find homes, jobs, and even wives. He set up a cloth manufacturing business to provide work for the refugees and established church services in different languages to meet their needs. In the house on Cannon Street, Calvin was a famous warrior for Christ, but he was also a faithful friend, always ready to lend a hand and a word of encouragement. Calvin's life in Geneva was far from peaceful. Enemies often arose, challenging his authority and the reforms he was implementing. One of the first to confront him was a young scholar named Sebastian Castellio. Calvin had appointed Castellio as the rector of the high school, but their relationship soon turned sour. Castellio was working on a translation of the New Testament, aiming to make it more accessible to the common people. He asked Calvin to recommend it for publication. Calvin, however, found the translation crude and inaccurate in some places. He didn't have the time to debate each issue with Castellio, and this led to frustration on both sides. Castellio's views on certain religious matters also differed from Calvin's. He believed the Song of Solomon was not a sacred text but a mere love story. He also disagreed with the phrase "descended into hell" in the Apostles' Creed and rejected the doctrine of predestination, which states that God has chosen who will be saved before the world began. When Castellio applied to become a pastor in Geneva, the consistory, led by Calvin, refused his application because of these doctrinal differences. Instead, they suggested raising his salary as rector. Castellio, feeling insulted, resigned from his position. Calvin, always trying to be helpful, wrote letters of recommendation for Castellio to find a job in Lausanne. But Castellio couldn't find a position there and returned to Geneva filled with anger towards Calvin. One afternoon, during a meeting of ministers and laymen, Castellio burst in and began to insult Calvin and the other ministers. He accused them of being unlike the Apostle Paul, saying they were whimsical, quick to anger, and lived wild and loose lives. Calvin, maintaining his composure, closed the Bible and left the room without a word. The little council, the city's governing body, ordered Castellio to leave Geneva. Despite their differences, Calvin and the other ministers still wrote letters of recommendation for Castellio, acknowledging his scholarly abilities. However, Castellio carried a deep-seated hatred for Calvin, which he later expressed in a book denouncing the burning of Michael's Servetus. Another enemy who emerged was Pierre Aimaux, a businessman whose wife was known for her libertine lifestyle. She was involved in multiple affairs, and Calvin advised the couple to separate. However, the little council was slow to grant Pierre a formal divorce, which took over a year and a half. During this time, Pierre's wife was imprisoned for 6 months, but Pierre was frustrated by the delay, adding to his troubles. His business of manufacturing playing cards suffered due to the stricter laws enforced by Calvin and the city council. These challenges tested Calvin's patience and leadership. Despite the personal attacks and the difficulties, Calvin remained committed to his vision of a reformed church and a just society. He continued to work tirelessly, writing letters advocating for reforms and supporting those in need, all while facing the constant opposition of his enemies. The struggle to reform Geneva was far from easy. Calvin faced constant opposition from the Libertines, a group of wealthy and powerful citizens who resisted his efforts to bring order and morality to the city. One of the most vocal opponents was Ami Perrin, a councilman and captain of the city militia, who was married to Francesca Favre, a woman known for her foul temper and defiance of authority. Perrin and his allies, Philibert, Berthelier, and Pierre Vandel, used every opportunity to challenge Calvin. They saw him as a foreigner who was trying to impose strict rules on their city. The battle came to a head over something as trivial as the style of breeches for the annual parade. Perrin wanted his militiamen to wear tight-slashed breeches, but Calvin argued that such immodesty would lead to further moral decay. The Council of 200 sided with Calvin, and Perrin, in a fit of pique, left town to avoid the parade. The consistory, a group of elders who oversaw the moral conduct of the city, worked tirelessly to enforce the new laws. They dealt with a wide range of offenses, from card playing during Sunday sermons to drunkenness and adultery. The city, once known for its wickedness, was slowly changing, but the process was painful and slow. In 1547, Francesca Perrin had another run-in with the consistory. She was brought before the ministers and elders for her misbehavior, and she lashed out at the minister Abel Pupin with vicious words. To avoid punishment, she fled the city, but not before attempting to run down Pupin with her horse. The next day, an anonymous letter appeared in the pulpit of Saint Pierre threatening the ministers. The letter was traced to Jacques Gruet, a former canon, who was arrested and executed for treason. Calvin, though not directly involved in the Gruet affair, was seen as the driving force behind the city's reforms. This only fueled the libertines' hatred. In December 1547, Calvin faced a violent scene at the town hall where councilmen were fighting among themselves. He bravely stepped into the fray, offering to be the first to shed blood if necessary. His words calmed the council, but he was deeply discouraged by their lack of resolve. The elections of 1549 brought more libertines into power, and Perrin was elected a syndic. Calvin's enemies grew bolder, and he faced insults and taunts wherever he went. Even children joined in calling him names and mocking him. The death of his wife, Idolette, in the spring of 1549 added to his burdens. He felt broken and alone, but he continued to fight for the reforms he believed were necessary. In 1551, a new enemy emerged, Jerome Bolsec, a former monk turned physician. Bolsec attacked Calvin's doctrine of election, calling it nonsense and accusing Calvin of making God a tyrant. Calvin, who had arrived unnoticed at a church discussion, stepped forward to defend his teachings with his usual eloquence and biblical knowledge. Bolsec was ordered to leave the city, but he later wrote a malicious book about Calvin, filled with lies and accusations. In 1552, another Genevan, Séraphin Trolliet, challenged Calvin's teachings on God's election. The debate was long and drawn out, but the little council ultimately declared Calvin's doctrine to be sound. However, they also declared Trolliet to be a good man and a good citizen, leaving the issue unresolved. Despite the constant attacks and the physical toll on his body, Calvin persevered. He suffered from asthma, pleurisy, hemorrhoids, kidney stones, and frequent headaches. Yet he continued to preach, teach, and work for the reform of Geneva. His dedication to the city and the church was unwavering, even as his health declined. Calvin's legacy in Geneva was a city that, while not perfect, was more orderly and moral than it had been before. The reforms he implemented laid the foundation for a community that valued the Word of God and the well-being of its citizens. Though the struggle was long and difficult, Calvin's unwavering faith and commitment to his cause made a lasting impact on the city and the world.